Hi everyone, welcome to Letters from Paradise and the Storyteller set. This is episode 68 that I've called Yeast. In the garden just outside the house, a tiny seed was pushed into the ground with all the hopes that something wonderful would come from it. Nearby, a happy cook could be seen through the kitchen windows, elbow deep in flour, singing as she took a measure of foaming yeast and poured it into the well she had made in the large hill of flour that was piled on the kitchen bench before her. The gardener knew what he had planted would stay neither small or hidden, but would soon burst through the soil and grow and keep on growing. Likewise, the cook knew that the measure of yeast that she had worked into the hill of flour to form a large lump of dough would permeate the entire lump, and it too would swell and increase on its way to being the day's delight for the whole family. But this was no ordinary seed, nor was the yeast just everyday yeast. No, they were the divine life of a loving king. They were the realm of this king's loving kindness and creative genius. When these stories were first told, the tiny seed and the measure of yeast were simply called the kingdom of heaven. Oh, and if we have seed from heaven and correspondingly heavenly yeast, then we have just met the heavenly gardener and heaven's happy cook. Yes, the King of Love himself has done something that defies description for its splendor, something for the ordinary world of cooks and gardeners, mothers and children, the busy and the lonely, well, all of us, regardless of race or creed, the world. Later that day in the kitchen, a woman bent over to retrieve her newest creation from the oven. "Sesquito!" the cook exclaimed in her best Italian, and indeed she and her family would find that there was no part of the loaf, not a mouthful, that wasn't completely delicious. Not one part that the yeast of heaven had not entered and permeated with its goodness. "Divine!" she exclaimed again. It took much longer, of course, for the gardener to see the full fruit of his labours, of the tiny seed he had long before pushed into the earth. But through the passage of time, the young seedling had just kept growing, advancing, filling the space around it. Its progress had been relentless, unstoppable, and can I say, glorious. The birds of the air had been watching what was going on. The magnificent tree that now stood where the seed long ago had been planted looked like home to them. They saw its strength as safety, its huge branches as the widest of welcomes. And so they came from everywhere, a multitude it seemed, and made their nests there. Oh, there's so much to love about these two parables from Jesus. For in these simple tales, he makes it abundantly clear that from the time he announced the presence of his kingdom on earth, that this realm of his benevolent rule has been progressively expanding, unhindered and uninterrupted, to infuse every part of society, every corner of the earth, every endeavour and institution for the good of all mankind. There's not a hint or word about evil in these stories. All we get here is the peaceful kingdom, the sun shining, the trees flourishing, the birds flying in and out as they raise their little ones who twitter away in their sheltered nests. There are no elements of hostility or fear here. All we get is a happy cook working away with wholesome ingredients, an aroma-filled house, freshly baked bread that sits on the table as chattering children take their portion and tell the stories of the day's adventures. Isaiah had told us about the Prince of Peace, that of the increase of his government and peace there would be no end. And 2 chapters later, in his prophetic book, that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And I love that both these picture stories show an ever-growing, a progressively infiltrating kingdom. They're telling us that the world is becoming a better place, not worse, just as history shows us. That God is ahead of us, pulling us forward. He always has been. That God is not behind back there in the past, endlessly trying to get us to return to how it used to be. No, good is winning. The tree keeps growing. The yeast keeps working. We should have an optimistic end-time view, for the King of Love's kingdom is advancing everywhere and filling the whole earth. Let's do another parable next week. Shalom.